The village of Burston is just north of Diss on the main line to Norwich, but trains don't stop there anymore. Yet there was a time, some 60 years ago, when Burston Village Green was a place of pilgrimage for British Labour people, showing solidarity with, of all things, the children of the village school. In this tranquil corner of Norfolk in the spring of 1914, just before the First World War, the local school children took the most drastic action in a spontaneous act of love. They came out on strike because their teachers had been sacked. It was famous enough to become news. A village schoolroom strike in 1914. How could it have come about? Yet it was a strike that was to go on for more than 20 years. It all began in the simplest way. The children of Burston loved their schoolmistress and schoolmaster and didn't want them to be unjustly fired. They probably didn't understand the politics of it all, but the political resonance was heard all over the country. They must have been a truly remarkable couple. Annie Higden, a certified teacher, and her husband Tom Higden, who was her assistant, deeply principled, old-fashioned socialists who'd had the council school at Burston for 3 years before they ran into trouble. There had been a prologue, of course. They had worked before in another school under the same Norfolk Education Committee a bit further north. This was in a village called Wood Darling, some 70 years ago. Wood Darling was a straggling little place in poor farming country where life was all right for the landowners but not for anyone else. There the husband and wife team of the Higdens ran a typical late Victorian country school, the classroom part of which was long ago swallowed up as a storage shed and the house made part of a farm. Some people still remember being taught by the Higdens all those years ago at the turn of the century. In those days, Ted Williams was a very little boy.
I believe I came to school when I was 4 and a half at this school, but Mr. Higden, as far as I remember or know, he didn't come here until 1902. Well, that left me about 7, you see. Mrs. Higden used to teach at this end of the school, and Mr. Higden, her desk was there, and Mr. Higden's desk was there, taught that end of the school.
There must have been about 90 children at the Wood Darling School then, the older ones all together in this one room with Annie and Tom Higden.
Well, they'd have prayers, then generally tables. We come into school at 9 o'clock in the morning.
In the door would come Mr. and Mrs. Higden. We should all be in our seats by then, and we'd have to salute, stand up, salute, and say, "Good morning, governors, good morning, sir." They would reply, "Good morning, children." Go straight to the desks, and Mr. Higden would open the register. He'd then call the register, starting from the top to the bottom of the classes. And all of those who were there at the time would get a red mark. If they came after he closed the register, they got a black one.
But Sidney Payne got no black marks because Sidney Payne was never late, and indeed never absent. Attendance and punctuality were valued in those days, and conscientiously Mrs. Higden set it all down in the logbook. She was strict, but she was very gentle, and her children remembered that. Farm workers' children for the most part, and very, very poor. Some were a bit better off, like Ted Williams, a farmer's son.
I thought Mrs. Higden was a very kind woman. She really kind, and the poor children in the school, she tried her hardest to get them something, a little extra, to what they'd had at home.
There's 11 of us. We have the sort of things like we see today, though. We lived outside with potatoes and just ordinary food. Well, I didn't have the wages because my father only earned 12 shillings a week.
Jessie Springle remembers especially how Mrs. Higden helped the girls with practical things like cooking, things that had meaning in poor farm workers' homes. Mrs. Higden didn't think all education was in books.
She learned us how to make all clothes and things and knitting. That's what was very good of her, because we used to go round and the people, and they were glad to buy them, you see. So you got them cheaper.
1903, 17th of March. Children taken for a ramble. One of them was Tom Barnes.
He used to take us on these here do's, and always used to give us scrambles with sweets and that, you know. And if we done anything outside the school and she got the hair of it, she was very annoyed, she was. She always used to punish us.
And I can remember if you didn't behave yourselves, you're going to stand on the stool in front of the class with your hands on your head.
But the Higdens were even sterner with the farmers when they found their pupils being illegally kept from school to work in the fields. There was one day when Tom Higden looked from the schoolroom window and he saw one of his regular truants having to work the land. Everyone remembered that day.
His name was Albert Carter, and on this very field in front of the school here, he was what we should call in Norfolk, leading the horse in the drill, the front horse. And Mr. Higden knew well enough he should be at school.
And he sent a note asking the boy, or the farmer to send the boy to school, and nothing happened. And I think he sent another note. I hate all this, you see, and still nothing happened. And then Tom went after him, and
he gave the farmer a black eye. See, and of course they went to court and he had to pay.
Tom Higden was fined 40 shillings and costs. It was only one of so many conflicts the Higdens would have with the local society. Annie and Tom Higden had their own rules, but all their unorthodoxy was motivated by one thing: what was best for the children. And in fact, it was best for the children. The government inspectors gave them wonderful notices saying the Higdens were energetic and industrious teachers. Two of their old pupils were George and Hetty Ransom.
She was a splendid teacher for singing and that sort of thing, sewing class and that sort of thing. I remember the French lady came there to stay, and she taught Forever with the Lord, and all I can remember was the first verse. La vida victoire que désirer mon cœur, je le demande peut-être well not among silver. Well, we used to say mong, and we used to have to say, no, that isn't right, this French lady used to say us mong. You had to sort of pronounce it like that, and we had that over and over again to get it right.
Once she tried to teach us French, but rather she got in a muddle with the managers and they cut that out.
The managers wanted to cut everything out of school but the 3 R's. It's hard to remember now how such a short time ago these rural communities were ruled by a combination of patronage and privilege that was pretty nearly feudal even then. The school managers were appointed by the Education Committee from the little circle of local bourgeoisie, the petty squirearchy and the parsonage. It wasn't an establishment that would take kindly to the uncompromising consciences of a Mr. and Mrs. Higden, who interpreted education literally as meaning not to cram in but to lead forth, which in those days meant socialism. It was inevitable that the Higdens were on a collision course with authority. Annie Higden was forever writing to the managers, drawing attention to something or other in the classrooms: smoking chimneys, smelly drains, damp walls. It did not increase her popularity, except, of course, with the children.
She would want to have a good fire the winter time, because some of us would be practically wet through by the time we got there. And there used to be a huge round guard right round the fire, and that used to be full of clothes drying off. You see, she used to stir the managers up, and of course they used to get so annoyed with her because she used to want more coal.
Oh, I used to kick up a lot of fuss about that. I used to. An awful lot of fuss. And of course that's why they got turned out of Wooddown School. She called one of the managers a lie, you know, and she apologised.
I think one thing led to another, and then I think there was with her husband, there was a bit of political part attached to it as well, because he was a man always, you know, stuck up for the agricultural workers a lot. Well, of course, that didn't all managers, they were nearly all farmers, of course, that didn't suit them.
He hated the farmers. Mr. Higden hated the farmers. He was right against them.
The fact is, to be sure, that Tom Higden was an intensely political man. He'd been working for the new local farm labourers' union, arguing that they were a very exploited community, as they were. He'd also become chairman of the parish council, replacing a local farmer who was chairman of the school managers. Tom Higden really got their old bourgeois backs up, and they made a united front to get rid of them both. They put in formal complaints to the Norfolk Education Committee on all manner of grounds, from Annie Higden using too much coal to general bloody-mindedness. And the result was that Mrs. Higden was told to resign and take her troublesome husband with her. So they left Wood Darling. Before they went away, Mrs. Higden signed off the school log with a few comments of her own that the Education Committee saw fit to censor from the record. The curious thing is that the Norfolk authorities did not rid themselves of the Higdens' consciences, but passed them on to another school that was going to become a small part of English history. On the 31st of January 1911, the Higdens arrived in the village of Burston and moved straight into the council school with 70 or 80 pupils, mostly the children of the farm workers all around. They are well remembered, especially by a woman who was a 10-year-old girl then, Violet Potter.
We thought they were the best teachers that we'd ever had. You know, they were so kind and so talkative to us, not like the teachers we'd had before, because I remember about 7 different teachers in that school. And they were all right as teachers, but they hadn't got the personality that Mr. and Mrs. Higden had, especially Mrs. Higden. She was one of the best. Wonderful things she did, you know, for the people and the children. If they came to school with poor boots and they took water, she'd buy them a new pair, all out of her own pocket.
Most of the pupils of that Burston school of 2 generations ago seem to have fallen under Mrs. Higden's spell. One was Marjorie Ling.
She used to take the children out in the country, around the fields, and we used to get all sorts of things and bring them home and draw them and things like that, you know.
She taught us typewriting. She had an old-fashioned typewriter, probably you wouldn't recognise it today, an old Oliver. And she brought that to school. That was her own. Taught some of us bigger children to use that.
School hours didn't seem to mean anything to Annie Higden. She'd teach as long as anyone wanted to learn.
We'd meet up the schoolhouse, 5 or 6 of us elder children, and go out into the playground, and she'd explain the Mars and Jupiter, and she studied the stars, and then we had to write about that the next day. I know I went once or twice, and we always used to get a cup of cocoa and a bun before we came home. So, yes, she did that, and a lot of different things that we didn't have when we had the other teachers. But still, it was all education, wasn't it?
Then, as now, Burston village was farming country. Working conditions were pretty awful. Housing was miserable. A farm worker's pay was about 12 bob a week. May Wilby remembers it all.
Mr. Higden was all for the Labourers' Union, and he came here and found there was nothing like that going on, and he started his work in that way, which I believe he had already started at Wood Darling, where he came from.
When we had the union here, we used to meet at the meeting, so we did congregate a bit more with the Higdens being here.
Arthur Moore was a young farmhand then, and he remembers the real climax of that time, which was when Tom Higden and some of the agricultural workers dared to put themselves up as candidates for the parish council election in 1913. And not only that, but had the impertinence to romp home as workers, and got a majority, with Tom Higden top of the poll.
And at the meeting, you see, some labourers went on, and Mr. Higden all went on, and the farmers, they were dissatisfied. They demanded the poll straight away. But then, most of the labourers got on. I think it was 5 got on, there was only 2 of theirs.
The real body blow was that the local parson wasn't